I don't know if you are familiar with art history, but I can say that in art history there is a big crisis since the beginning of the century. The idea being that art history is very mean, is very hierarchical, very unfair to the so-called peripheries of the globe. So far, we always work on the same figures, on the same men, white from Paris or New York, and on the same kinds of art. And so I want to, in this state of affairs, so to say, global art history, global theories have been very important in the debate about that. How can we change the discipline? How can we make place for different origins, different movements, different kinds of art from all over the globe. And so I can say, to be very schematic, that in art history, two ideas of the global have dominated, emerged since 10, 15 years. One which is dominant is mainly inspired by post-colonial issues, with the idea that the first goal of global approach is to give place to the peripheries, as I said. And the other comes from the discipline of history. It is interested in transnational questions, but much more familiar maybe for you here. It draws attention to the circulation of artworks, artists, mediators, series, etc., with or without an interest in cultural transfer. And there is a third possible idea of the global, which has little place in the way global art history is practiced. I mean the global in the sense of total. Total and global can be synonyms in French. I don't know how it is in Spanish, but it is in the sense of a total approach that would try to gather big series of data, international data over large time spans, and that would work on this data to get an idea of world evolutions and processes. We cannot separate the three approaches. But I would still say that the first one, the post-colonial, albeit motivated by generous intention, does not change the main reasons why art history has been so unfair, so hierarchical, and colonial. It does not change the methods of the discipline, which have contributed to the asymmetries, to the absences, and to the abuses that the post-colonial approach seeks to address. They can be summarized as follows. First, methodological nationalism, the assignation of an artwork, an artist, or indeed an art to a nationality, which is the natural result of an excessive focus on a small group of capitals, Paris and New York for contemporary period, and the ethnocentrism of the discipline. Secondly, monography. So that's the statistics I made in 2008, and I'm quite sure it has not changed a lot. Beginning with the titles of the PhDs in France, you can see that more than 1/3 and plus 1/3 and 1/2 and 1/4, pardon, is dedicated to one single figure or two or a small group of persons among PhDs. I'm not criticizing that because that book is made of many PhDs I could read, but it's an issue still. And so monography is an issue, and it is often better understood as hagiography, focusing on one single figure, clearly a genius, capable of understanding, innovating, deconstructing, revolutionizing more or less everything in one fell swoop, and whom no one recognized long after his death, of course, as prophet. And third, so it's a kind of culpabilizing hagiography that we love so much. And third, evolutionism, which is with the idea, the naive idea, that history would be a continuous evolution towards better futures and against the past, a past always presented as passéist and allergic to the new. Evolutions that are naturalized, as if history were a Darwinian evolution with the success of the strongest against the weakest. And so last but not least, formalism and its inherent denial of social and economic dimension. There is much to think that these methodologies are responsible for the colonial settings of art history. Some decolonial thinkers, as they are told in the wake of the philosophy of liberation, if you know about that, they stress that decolonization processes have not been totally achieved because of our ways of thinking, our methods, our ways of writing and selecting our sources. They encourage what they call the cognitive justice. Scholars should recognize and value texts and attitudes toward arts and cultural practices that come from outside our criteria, outside our habits and practices. So we should decolonize, and one of these theoricians, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for instance, calls for a new ecology of knowledges, proposing to splice scientific methods with other ways of thinking that would be non-Cartesian, non-Western, etc. And yet it is difficult, especially for me, born and educated in France, and from a white family and so on. I'm not able to decolonize my mind, my heart, and so, but maybe I could decolonize my methods. And the idea is that with quantitative, cartographic, and sociological and transnational approaches, we could try to do so. Pardon. And so very concrete methods offer an alternative to the traditional approaches of art history. First, against methodological nationalism, we can work on cultural transfer and circulation. Against formalism and the denial of the social and the economic, we can add sociological and economical questions in art history. And against monocentrism and nationalism, we can use geography to think the spaces of arts outside political compartmentalization and nation states. And so my impression is that the circulatory approach, so the second idea of the global approach, and the third one, the total approach, are can be efficient in shaking the canon and decolonizing art history. I'm just talking about what I know. And help meet the challenges posed by the first post-colonial acceptation of the global. Consequently, I would like to promote a large understanding of the global in the sense of a total approach. One that would try to gather first big series of global international data over large time spans first, and would work then on these data to get an idea of world evolutions and processes, crossed with transnational questions. So this is the second scale. This large approach would be articulated with the micro level, so a third scale, on the case studies and the traditional methodologies we use in art history. Maybe you have caught the allusion to Fernand Braudel. I don't know if you know about this historian. In France, he's one of the leader historians of the École des Annales, one of the key founders of global history as such in France. And his PhD is great. I love that book. Is articulated in three parts. The first, La part du milieu, examines the geographical milieu in which history took place, from the Mediterranean mountains to the seas and the deserts. The second considers the economic, political, social, and military structures in which the men of the 16th century were living. With not national history, but attention to encounters, circulation. And the third one, only the third one, pays attention to events, the men involved or the women involved, the politics and little stories. Even if the scales I work with are different from Braudel's, I don't work on the geography of the Mediterranean, etc., and I am not Braudel, but I will try to explain how I work with this kind of tripartite presentation, with first, so the distant approach I use, then the middle scale, circulation, and then the third scale, the scale of the monography, which I also practice, the so-called close reading of artworks, so mainly painting, sculpture, and graphics. which can be analyzed and maybe understood differently once you have done this first distance and medium scale study. First, the distance. The history of art provides numerous and homogeneous sources that remain remarkably consistent over time, which contain vast quantities of information that have only rarely been considered as a whole. I'm referring to exhibition catalogs, journals, and auction catalogs. I will now discuss the first two in more details. A journal means a title, a year, you will agree with me, a place of publication, a publisher. It means editors, writers, translators, illustrators for arts, articles with title, text, images, pages, and so on. This information can be serialized. It can be serialized whether in a given issue, across every issue of a given title, or even through the comparison of several titles across a geographical and temporal scale that the researcher can define. With increasingly accessible and simple statistical tools at your disposal, such as Excel, which is quite easy to use, we can create chronologies and then maps. This is an example of an inquiry I made for the second volume, which will be published this next month. I needed a distant view of what was published among the avant-gardes, and so I made my small database of every possible journal of modernist journals in the interwar, and I found these almost 400 journals, and just put them in small cases according to the region where they came from, and then made my chronology. I will not analyze it now. You can make maps and see how it evolves or not, which is very interesting and opens new questions you did not have before you began to work. With the Atlas project, I am now focusing my energy on constructing a database using data from exhibition catalogs. Exhibition catalogs represent a plentiful source of literature dating back to their invention in 1673, maybe before, but we don't know any earlier catalog until now. Today, exhibition catalogs crisscross the world art market. An exhibition catalog is a book that gives or claims to give information as to the existence of an exhibition, its address, its date, its title. It lists or claims to list the artists who participated and often the works that were exhibited. They provide a rich source of data, whether social, commercial, geographical, or even political. Artists' addresses, genders, places of birth, the names of masters, the addresses of their art dealer, the names and locations of collectors, the places where works are stored, the prices sometimes. The titles which are listed may reveal recurring patterns of words or themes, and are sometimes accompanied by text written by artists and selection committees, as well as illustrations and reproductions, or even advertisements. By bringing together this homogeneous source in a database with a wide temporal and spatial scope, and by using them in conjunction with digital tools, we can raise and address a wide range of issues and questions. So since 2009, we have constructed a database of geographical and historical data extracted from catalogs produced worldwide from the 18th century to the present. The database was conceived and tested to allow for catalogs from a diverse range of regions and periods, from Europe to Asia, Africa, from European biennials of the 50s to exhibitions in the 70s in Argentina, etc. All available addresses are geo-referenced, which means that we put a latitude and a longitude, as I said, to every address, even if the address disappeared, which is a nightmare, but which we managed to do not so bad. And then we have the basis for a broad study. This is for people who know what are databases. It's shows a simplified model of the database, which explains that it is very complicated. So we have a basis for a broad study of artistic activity, whether sociological or international, circulation of artwork, circulation of trajectories of names, fashion in titles, even fashion in first names of artists, for instance. When were people named Ernest more than, I don't know, Wilhelm, etc. So that's how we check addresses. I go quickly. And so it's a very interesting source because it is homogeneous, it is sourced, timestamped, signed. We know when people put data into the database. Very important questions when you do that in an academic world, when people have to be accredited for the work they do. All the more since when you do database, it's not in your CV, it's not in the reports you send to the university. And we must thank people for the work they do, etc. This is an idea of the query interface that we are working on now, with the possibility to query the database and get single catalogs, and then to make maps or chronologies and maps together. So that's the idea, that's what we want. Here it's just design. It's a much difficult to put that into reality, but we are progressing, and we will open the database to the public in 2018. Very quickly, now we are doing a complete harvest of biennial catalogs. The idea being that with biennials, which were created first in Venice in 1895, and then gradually after 1950 in São Paulo in Brazil, and then in Tokyo in Japan, in Alexandria in Egypt, in Ljubljana in Slovenia, in Paris in '59, etc. Gradually we will be able to have a very complete and broad collection of very global data that will help us work on the circulation of art, trajectories, see if people circulate, if artworks circulate or not at the time of the Cold War and until the present. That's what we are doing, and it's fascinating. When you do that, once you have a comparable set of sources, you can extract your data from the catalogs and the journals, etc., and you can order them according to sociological, geographic, let's say, objective criteria, even if objectivity is something that has to be problematized. I still think that when you see something in a list, it's in the list. If I'm researching, for instance, the circulation of modern art, that's for that book, I can see where exhibitions of modern art were held in a given period. This map, for instance, makes clear that artistic activity was by no means confined to Paris between the turn of the 20th century and the outbreak of the First World War. I was focusing at the beginning for my PhD on only on Paris, on the circulation of the so-called diffusion of modernist painting from Paris to the world. When I made these maps, by intellectual honesty and rigor, I had to investigate all of the points that were visible on the map. I was working on the internationalization of Paris avant-garde, from realism to cubism, and in an attempt to gain some critical distance on the notion of what circulated from Paris to other cities, I began with this survey of all possible, well-known and regular exhibitions of modern arts at the time. And the most interesting events were not necessarily taking place in Paris. That was very striking. London and Brussels emerged simultaneously as sites of modern activity. What was signified by the appearance of these points on the map at the same time at the same point in time So in order to answer new questions I had not imagined, I had to look at which artworks were circulating, where they were being displayed. I had to look at sources I was not prepared to work on. And I had to change my diffusionist hypothesis. I had to get out of that and to look at the so-called peripheries. And then I realized that the so-called centrality of Paris at the beginning of the 20th century did not work, was not how we still think it was. We can do the same kind of inquiry, so I don't epiloguate because everything is in the book. But now, last year at the ArtLab seminar, we did same kind of inquiry. We wanted to make a list of every possible exhibitions that happened, living art exhibitions in the Arab countries from Morocco to Iraq. This is not finished because it takes time, but we could find almost 1,400 exhibitions from 1900 to 1990, which makes these horrible graphs, but very interesting evolutions and questions. For instance, you realize that even in Morocco in 1967, less activity in art. What happened in 1967? You know, this war between Israel and Egypt, but not in Morocco. So that is something to work on. There is a PhD subject here. And you can see also other evolutions that had to be tested with other sources, but it is fascinating to have this first kind of idea of what happens in a region and for art. And we can do maps, also here, a map by periods. Something I didn't know about, for instance, I would have said that everything happened in one point for one country. It's not the case for Morocco. It's not the case for Lebanon, for instance. And you see how it evolves. And that's also very interesting. What happened in this period and why less afterwards and why more then, etc. That's something we do and which is very interesting to have another idea of what happens on a period, etc. If I go now to the middle scale study, data taken from exhibition catalogs and from journals is also very useful for middle scale questions. First, we can identify circulation channels. Where do these or those groups of artists come from? Where do they exhibit? Where do they publish articles? Which groups collect what or that, etc. Here you can see a representation of the nationality of artists exhibiting at the Salon d'Automne in their respective addresses. Here not only the foreign exhibitors. Very interesting to see that their geography first evolves right to the south after 1908, and is very different. You can see that here because you can't compare with the French, but the French used to live here, not here. That's very interesting. And if you change, also, if you go to the very, very precise definition, you realize that here you have the street of the Catalans. I'm kidding. I don't know if it is this one because I forgot. But here and here the street where the American live, here the Anglophone, etc. That's very interesting to see how nationalities or cultural appartenances were recomposed and reorganized on one place, and how also they could be mixed or not, and who could meet whom at what time, etc. You can also see where artists exhibit, for instance, Matisse. But just to compare, yes, here it's a manually made map just to show for people who would be skeptical against the digital, the difference between what could be done. That was done 2 or 3 years ago. That I had to do that manually in the years 2000. At that time, it was very difficult to make maps. And for instance, that map you saw here, it took me 6 months to do that. Now, in 6 clicks, you can make a map. That's why we must use these big data and these tools that we can have with the digital. You can see not only where arts or artists or their names circulate, but also who helps them circulate. with journals, for instance, journals are very important in the international strategies of avant-garde groups. I don't know if you understand French, but here it's Romanian journal, and they claimed notre groupement compte parmi ses collaborateurs les meilleurs écrivains et artistes du mouvement moderniste de tout le monde. There is a mistake. It's not very good French because we would say du monde entier, not de tout le monde. But they say our group has the best collaborators and the best scribers, merci, writers and artists in the world. Though just saying we are in the international field. And so you see that also on other journals. This is a Hungarian one which was in Vienna. This one was Le Corbusier's journal. You see they show their friends, their international friends. Their Sturm was in Berlin, and they also show the city. So they assess their international networks. You can do that also with these awful tools that are called analyse de réseau. This is not something that is to be published. It's something exploratory. It has a heuristic value in research. But when I worked for my second volume, I wanted also to see who was connected with whom. And that was very interesting. For instance, I could see with journals, this graphic alerted me to the gradual split between the innovative milieu of Central Europe and Germany and the logics at work in the Parisian milieus of the 20s. In France, there is this idea that everything happens in Paris in the 20s, that the surrealists were the center, that they were international, etc. And when you look at the actual connections between avant-gardist networks, you realize that the surrealists are very isolated. And then it helped me reconsider the place of the surrealists and realize that they were totally isolated, that they didn't want to speak with the others, that the real center was actually the periphery. And I also could see then that many artists left Paris at the beginning of the 20s and wrote in their letters and in their articles, nothing happens in Paris, I want to go to Weimar, I want to go to the States, I want to go to the Netherlands, etc. And some stood in Paris, like Miro, who could be helped by Picasso and the strong network of the Catalan in Paris, but it was a minority. And the others, Archipenko left Paris, Mondrian had to plant flowers to survive. That's not well known, but he painted flowers, Mondrian, and he wanted to stop painting. Van Doesburg, Mondrian's friend, left Paris and went to Weimar, where he opened a studio, etc. So that's something very useful to get out of the prejudices we have on our own history or about the history of the others. So just to go quick. Once we begin investigating the circulation of art, we go beyond the perennial question of the center and the periphery. Any place can potentially be a center or a periphery, depending on the chosen point of view. What counts is circulation and how it circulates. I'm convinced of the great impact of the approach of cultural transfer for a global study of art history. I don't know if you know about these methods. Cultural transfer, transfer culturel, developed by many in literature and comparative literature now. It's kind of mindset, not a methodology, much more a state of mind, which considers mobility first, and reciprocally, circulation happens everywhere. So the circulation of persons and objects, the circulation between social, linguistic, cultural, and even historical contexts. What comes from the past circulates and is transformed in the circulation when it comes to us. That's very interesting too. They identify mediators, qualify their activity. Sometimes translators are these so-called double men who do mediation, write art critical texts, organize exhibitions, translate texts, etc. So we are incited to study their action, positive or negative, because some mediators prevent things from circulation. That's not enough studied, but for instance, between Paris and Vienna, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was nothing, almost nothing that circulated. And circulation was very important in politics, but not in art. And that's very interesting. Why? With cultural transfer, we want also to study the impact of transfer from a space to the other, impact on the place of departure, and also impact of the place of arrival. For instance, in art, it's very interesting. When you say, oh, I exhibited in New York, even if it was in a garage or in something ugly, no one knows, no one cares, but they hear he or she exhibited in New York. And that's great because it changed your reputation locally. And that works. And that worked for Picasso, it worked for Matisse, it worked for, and it works also today for us as academic. I'm in Barcelona. I gave a talk in Barcelona, and I will tell that to my colleagues in Paris because it helps augment my reputation. So there is an impact on the place of arrival. And also with cultural transfer, we want to analyze the circulation itself, describe its axes, and describe how it circulates. I like, last but not least, to add sociological questions to better understand how the global work or doesn't work. For instance, there is a very interesting case, which is the international network of artists at around 1900. And you can do a sociology of them, which is very interesting because if you know about the history of art in 1905, everything exploded globally in Europe. You had the Fauve in Paris, the expressionists in Dresden. You had expressionists also in Moscow, and many struggled and fought to prove who was first. Actually, no one was first. They just reacted to the same fact, the same problem. The closing, the social monopoly over artistic careers by a tiny group which was cosmopolitan, transnational, very well educated, etc., and had confiscated modernity all over Europe. And that's very interesting, and I tried, for instance, to study these groups and to see, for instance, who exhibited the most in the good salon of modern art around in the 19th and around between 1890 and 1905. And you see maybe names, you know, this one you don't know, Jacques-Émile Blanche, but he painted a very well-known portrait of Proust. But maybe you know Max Liebermann, who's the head of the modernists in Berlin. Whistler, you know, maybe. Zorn, Meunier. So these well-known names, and what is very interesting is that the younger they are, the more aristocratic they are. And so gradually this milieu was more and more aristocratic, which meant that people like Matisse or like Picasso or like the expressionists in Dresden, which were from lower states, lower classes socially, couldn't get in this milieu and couldn't exhibit, couldn't be well known, and at the end they exploded. And that's very interesting also to understand the evolution of art history and of style, etc., which is not only a formal question. This is, yes, a map of, for instance, where these elites live. They lived in the very rich area of Paris, which is Parc Monceau and so on. Well, interesting because you have that in the catalogs. And so that helps also make the sociology of the elite in a special field, art, modern art. Yes, that's not interesting. Not to finish in 2 minutes. The micro scale. When you have spent thousands of hours copying exhibition catalogs, you realize that you know much about art history in its details, about the names and even about the works which are reproduced in the catalogs, and that you know about them much better than the very close reading adept who do not so much more about their about art except about their own project. I'm very mean, but I'm just, I heard so much critics against distant reading, you don't know anything. No, I copied the catalogs and I know them much better than you. That's what I can now answer to my so-called enemies. But then consequently, you can have another idea on one specific artwork or one specific artist or one specific trajectory, because you have this very distant idea of what is around them. I could, for instance, tell something about Picasso's international aura. Picasso was very well known as soon as 1912 internationally. And it's very interesting to ask why could he be so well known. Yes, he was a genius, etc. But maybe there were other explanations. And when I made my maps, if you look at that map, this Picasso's exhibition before 1908. Matisse exhibition, you see there is a difference. At that time, Matisse and Picasso were beginning enemies in Paris because Matisse had been very quickly taken by a big gallery as soon as 1906, and Picasso was the enemy of Matisse in the field. But then you see the exhibition of Picasso from 1909 to 1914, and what can you see, or can't you see? Nothing in Paris. And that was an issue. I had to see why first and what was the result of that. So I will be very quick, but what I could see when I went to the artworks, to the images, and when I do this very traditional work in art history to recognize what was exhibited, etc., I realized that first, what was exhibited was always chronological. So the blue period, and then the Rosa period, and then the Cézannean Cubist, and then stop until 1913, the beginning of 1913, which means that until 1913, no Cubist work were exhibited abroad by Picasso's art dealer, whereas Picasso was Cubist since 2 years. And so in Europe, they could see these wonderful artworks that they could love. They knew that Picasso was avant-gardist, was very well known, etc., but they saw great things proving that he had an academic training, that he was very good. So that's what was the modernist, the most modern things that were exhibited at that time in 1910. That was what he did, what he made. Next year, 1911, so you see, only one, yes, I had to be honest, there was one drawing, just a drawing, it's a sketch. So when you do a sketch, you are allowed to be kind of sketchy, but not for paintings. So the paintings, you had the blue period, that was the most recent work that was exhibited at that time in Germany, and then this so-called Cézanne period. This for 12, you see, again, nothing to do with the recent works that Picasso did at that time. And so his dealer dared to exhibit Picasso, the Cubist Picasso, 2 or 3 years after he had made him known in Europe. And what did he do? First, he always exhibited the Cubist work with former works that proved that Picasso had come to Cubism gradually from research, that he was some kind of artistic color. And so Picasso was introduced like someone very brilliant, which was the case, but which was not the case in Paris. In Paris, you couldn't see that. And so it shows that to build a genius, you need strategies, you need a kind of pedagogy, and that everything is made with circulation, and that the global is linked with the genius, so to say, as far as art history is concerned. And also, which is interesting, when you have copied thousands of catalogs, you see, when you see a date at that time in 12, it's quite rare. Putting dates in catalogs is very, very new at that time. And then a second and last case, for instance, do you know about Bicyclette, this artwork, which was made by Duchamp and is supposed to be the first ready-made? When you know about that work, it is often interpreted as a research on kinetic questions, a proof of the distance, of the detachment of the ready-made, the idea that you decide that it is an artwork because you decided, and you put it on a kind of pedestrian, on a kind of pedestal, and that you sign it. So that's a theory of the ready-made. I have nothing against it, but it doesn't help me understand why it was done at that time, and why a bicycle. Why not, I don't know, or anything else. What is interesting is that Duchamp, in 1912, was painting this painting, which was his favorite painting. He took time to paint it, and he thought it was a great painting. And when he exhibited that at the Salon des Indépendants in 1912, he had to take it back, because his brothers, his friends, the Cubist friends told him, we don't want that in the Salon. And why didn't they want that? Because it was too futuristic. Nothing to do with the wheel, but too futuristic meant that he could be accused of imitation of the futurists, which were the enemies of the moment in Paris. And so Duchamp was disgusted. So disgusted that he left and went to Munich, where he had a friend. He had a good friend. When he went to Munich, I made my maps. There is nothing quite. We have three sources about the stay in Munich. We have a card he sent, a postcard he sent, a photography he made here, a postcard he sent from there, and we know that he went there because he wrote from there with a paper. And so I could make a map, and I realized that to go from here to there are two possible ways. But with this way, Duchamp had to pass by two galleries, or could pass by one or the other. And in these galleries, he could see exhibitions of Parisian artworks of that time. Delaunay was one of the people who expelled him from the Salon. So someone he hated. Actually, many other things in the sources helped me see that he hated him. And what is interesting in Delaunay, that Delaunay made Roux, la Grande Roue, le biplan de Blériot, the Tour Eiffel. Delaunay was very international. He had many friends. He was friend with Kandinsky. He exhibited in Munich. And he wanted to illustrate modernity with modern painting. And so you see, first, the bicycle can be a kind of criticism of the wheel, saying, okay, you make your wheel, you work a lot, you explain everything to the press, because Delaunay was very talkative about his work, but okay, I do you the wheel. First idea. But also, there was in Paris, there was a kind of sportive idea of painting. Louis Blériot was the star. He had crossed the channel, and many artists, among them Delaunay, painted homage to Blériot. And which is very interesting is that Blériot was a kind of example of what the artist could be. The artist had to be, the modern artist had to be a professional, a sportsman, a kind of army man struggling in an international competition at that time. In the competition, so you had the Cubists and you have the Futurists here. It is just proving that actually, yes, Duchamp's painting was kind of futuristic, hence the explanation. But then, and if you go to the futurists, they love sports, they love planes, they published a manifesto, and the manifesto, if you read it, is great, because you can read the story of, at the beginning, Marinetti in his car, driving very fast, and meeting two bicycle men who push him in the I don't know what's the name in English, but so here again, a bicycle. And that's why gradually you find another idea of futurism. You know about maybe Victoire de Samothrace, a claim of the futurist, etc. The Victoire de Samothrace is like that. And that's a kind of Victoire de Samothrace too, which was also maybe an idea of that, oh, he's doing a futurist thing, etc. But then, so that's just to explain very quickly, and I am finished, that if you have this distant, this secretive way, and this kind of sociological idea of art history, you can understand artworks differently. And interestingly, I think, even if I love formalism, etc., but I think it adds also to the very usual methods of the discipline, and it also adds a global dimension to the artworks, which is not in the formalist one. If you have now, for me, the wheel is an international artwork. It talks about the futurists, it talks about Munich, it talks about Delaunay, it talks about Louis Blériot, many things, and not only about the autonomy of the artists and the artwork. Thank you.